Elder Paisios saw what governments would never admit. Decades before smartphones tracked your location, before digital IDs became normalized, before biometric surveillance blanketed cities, this orthodox monk described the precise sequence of technological adoption that would condition humanity to accept the mark of the beast. His prophecy was not symbolic. It was a blueprint. This is the digital mark, Elder Paisios' prophecy on technology and the mark of the beast. Every warning he uttered is unfolding now, and the final step approaches faster than anyone dares to acknowledge. The mountain monastery stood against time itself, stone walls holding centuries of prayer within their cold embrace. And within those walls lived a man whose eyes perceived not merely the present moment, but the unfolding machinery of future ages. Elder Paisios of Mount Athos walked paths worn smooth by generations of monks, his sandaled feet treading the same earth that had supported saints and seekers. Yet his mind traveled forward through decades, witnessing technologies that did not yet exist, systems of control that had not yet been conceived by the engineers and politicians who would later bring them into being. His fellow monastics noticed the weight he carried, the way his gaze would drift beyond the physical world during prayer, how he would emerge from his cell with warnings that seemed impossible, descriptions of invisible networks and marks embedded beneath skin, prophecies that sounded like fever dreams to those who heard them in the quiet of monastic life. Visitors came seeking spiritual guidance, expecting comfort or blessing, but instead received urgent warnings about a future where humanity would voluntarily surrender freedom for convenience, where technology would become the mechanism of spiritual separation, where the ancient prophecy of revelation would manifest not through obvious tyranny, but through incremental acceptance of systems designed to monitor, control, and ultimately separate souls from divine protection. The elder spoke with precision that disturbed even those who revered him, describing devices that would fit in pockets and track every movement, numbers that would replace names, systems that would make survival impossible without participation, and he insisted this was not allegory or metaphor, but literal reality approaching with the certainty of sunrise, a reality that would present itself as progress while functioning as perdition. The year was 1988, when Elder Paisios gave one of his most explicit warnings to a group of pilgrims who had traveled to Mount Athos seeking his counsel, their notebooks ready to capture wisdom about prayer or fasting, but instead they transcribed something that would haunt them for decades. He described a system that would begin with convenience, with cards that people would use willingly, because they simplified transactions and eliminated the need to carry currency. And he explained that these cards were merely the first step in a carefully designed progression toward a mark that would be placed in the hand or forehead, exactly as described in the biblical prophecy of Revelation chapter 13. The pilgrims exchanged nervous glances, uncertain whether to interpret his words as spiritual metaphor or literal prediction. But the elder's tone left no room for symbolic interpretation. He spoke with the directness of someone describing an approaching storm, not a parable. He warned that governments would introduce these technologies gradually, always with reasonable justifications: security against theft, protection against fraud, efficiency in commerce, and that each generation would accept the next level of intrusion because the previous level had already been normalized. The process would be so gradual that few would recognize the spiritual danger until the final step, when refusal would mean exclusion from society, inability to purchase food or shelter, complete isolation from economic participation, and by that point, the majority of humanity would already be conditioned to accept whatever mark or system was required because they had accepted every previous step without resistance. What distinguished Elder Paisios from countless other religious figures who issued vague warnings about end times was the specificity of his predictions, the technical details he provided about systems that did not yet exist in any recognizable form during his lifetime. He described global networks that would connect every person through numbers, identification systems that would transition from paper to digital, and eventually to biological integration, and he specified that the technology would advance from external cards to implanted chips, from voluntary adoption to mandatory participation. He told the pilgrims that there would come a point where children would be marked from birth, where the system would be so comprehensive that opting out would be presented as antisocial, dangerous, even criminal, and that the spiritual test would not be in recognizing obvious evil, but in resisting incremental normalization. The elder explained that the enemy of souls was patient, working across generations, understanding that what one generation rejects as intrusive, the next generation accepts as normal, and the third generation cannot imagine living without, and this patient strategy would be far more effective than sudden imposition because it would face minimal resistance. He emphasized that the true danger was not the technology itself, but the spiritual submission it represented, the gradual acceptance of external authority over internal conscience, the replacement of divine guidance with algorithmic control, and ultimately the choice to prioritize physical survival and social inclusion over spiritual integrity and divine connection. The monks who lived alongside Elder Paisios witnessed his anguish over these visions, the way he would weep during prayer for the billions who would unknowingly walk into spiritual danger, believing themselves to be embracing progress and security. He confided to his closest brothers that what troubled him most was not the technology itself, but the deception embedded within it, the way it would be presented as humanitarian, as protective, as the solution to problems that had been deliberately engineered to create demand for the very systems that would enslave. He spoke of manufactured crises that would condition populations to surrender liberty for safety, of economic collapses that would make people grateful for digital systems that promised stability, of security threats that would justify increasingly invasive surveillance. And he insisted that every crisis would be real enough to be convincing while serving a larger agenda that remained hidden from public awareness. The elder described a future where privacy would be ridiculed as outdated, where those who resisted monitoring would be portrayed as dangerous extremists, where the refusal to participate in identification systems would be grounds for suspicion, investigation, and ultimately elimination from social participation. He warned that the persecution of believers would not come through obvious religious oppression, but through economic exclusion, through the inability to function in society without accepting the mark, and that this would test faith more severely than physical violence, because it would affect families, children, daily survival, and the temptation to compromise would be overwhelming for all but the most spiritually prepared. Elder Paisios emphasized repeatedly that the progression toward the mark of the beast would follow a predictable pattern, beginning with paper identification, advancing to plastic cards with magnetic strips, evolving to cards with embedded chips, transitioning to biometric scanning, and culminating in subcutaneous or biological marks that would be presented as the ultimate in convenience and security. He told pilgrims to watch for each stage and to recognize that every stage was designed to condition acceptance of the next, that the enemy understood human psychology perfectly and would exploit the natural human tendency toward convenience, conformity, and fear of social exclusion. The elder specified that the transition from external to internal marking would be justified through practical concerns. Cards could be lost or stolen, but an implanted chip could not. Biometric scanning was inconvenient, but a permanent mark would streamline every transaction. The system would be presented as serving human needs, when in reality humans were being shaped to serve the system. He warned that by the time the final mark was introduced, the majority of humanity would accept it without spiritual hesitation, because they would have been accepting similar systems for decades, and the spiritual significance would be obscured by the practical familiarity of the technology, making the eternal consequences invisible until too late. The pilgrims who received these warnings in 1988 returned to their lives in a world that still used paper money predominantly, where computers were rare and primitive, where the internet did not yet exist in public form, where mobile phones were luxury items the size of briefcases, and the elder's warnings seemed fantastical, belonging more to science fiction than spiritual prophecy. Yet Elder Paisios insisted with absolute certainty that they would witness these developments within their lifetimes, that the progression would accelerate rapidly once it began, and that their responsibility was not to prevent the prophesied events, which were inevitable, but to remain spiritually vigilant, to recognize each stage for what it represented, and to choose divine protection over earthly convenience when the final test arrived. He gave specific spiritual instructions for how to prepare, emphasizing prayer, fasting, sacramental participation, and most critically, the conscious rejection of fear as a motivator for spiritual compromise, because fear would be the primary weapon used to compel acceptance of the mark. The elder taught that perfect love casts out fear, that trust in divine providence must supersede trust in human systems, and that the willingness to suffer economic exclusion and social isolation for the sake of spiritual integrity would be the defining test of authentic faith in the generation that faced the final mark. 3 decades after Elder Paisios delivered his precise warnings about the technological progression towards spiritual danger, the world transformed in ways that validated every detail he described, each innovation arriving exactly as he predicted, each stage of acceptance following the pattern he outlined with disturbing accuracy. The 1990s introduced magnetic strip cards that replaced cash transactions for millions, presented as convenient solutions to the inconvenience of carrying currency, and entire populations embraced them without considering the surveillance infrastructure being constructed with every swipe. Banks promoted these cards as modern necessities, retailers incentivized their use with rewards programs, and within a single generation, the idea of tracking every purchase became so normalized that suggesting it might serve darker purposes became socially unacceptable, dismissed as paranoia by a population that had already surrendered the very privacy they once considered fundamental. The elder had warned that the first stage would seem innocent, beneficial even, and that resistance would be minimal because the spiritual implications would not be apparent, and his prediction manifested with perfect precision as billions voluntarily entered themselves into financial surveillance systems without recognizing what they were building. The arrival of the Internet in the mid-1990s accelerated the trajectory Elder Paisios described, creating the global network he referenced decades before its existence, connecting humanity through digital systems that tracked, recorded, and analyzed every interaction. What began as a tool for academic communication rapidly evolved into comprehensive infrastructure for commerce, social interaction, and information exchange. And with each expansion came new levels of monitoring that users accepted as necessary costs for participation. The elder had specifically mentioned that there would be a global network through which all transactions and communications would flow, making it possible to monitor every individual simultaneously, and the Internet provided exactly that infrastructure, built voluntarily by governments and corporations, working in coordination towards systems of total information awareness. The introduction of cookies, browsing history, digital profiles, and algorithmic tracking represented the foundation for the surveillance architecture that would later justify biological marking, yet populations embraced these intrusions because they were presented as enhancing user experience, personalizing content, improving security, and the spiritual danger remained invisible beneath layers of technical justification and corporate marketing. The emergence of smartphones in the early 21st century marked a critical escalation in the sequence Elder Paisios described, placing tracking devices directly into the pockets and hands of billions who carried them willingly, even paying premium prices for increasingly sophisticated surveillance technology. These devices combined location tracking, communication monitoring, biometric identification, and financial transaction capability in single units that users carried voluntarily, creating the most comprehensive surveillance network in human history without requiring any government mandate. The elder had warned specifically about devices that would track location constantly, that would know more about individuals than they knew about themselves, and that would become so integrated into daily life that living without them would seem impossible. And smartphones fulfilled every aspect of that prophecy while being embraced as liberation and progress. Parents gave them to children, employers required them for workers, social participation became dependent on them, and within 2 decades they transformed from novelty to necessity, exactly as Elder Paisios predicted they would, conditioning humanity to accept constant monitoring as normal, beneficial, and ultimately indispensable. The introduction of biometric identification systems represented another precise fulfillment of the elder's warnings, moving from traditional identification through documents to identification through biological characteristics. Fingerprints, facial recognition, iris scanning, voice patterns, exactly as he described the progression from external to biological marking. Airports implemented fingerprint scanning. Smartphones adopted facial recognition. Banks introduced voice verification, and national identification systems began incorporating biometric data, all justified through security concerns that were real enough to compel acceptance while serving the larger agenda of normalizing biological identification. Elder Paisios had warned that there would be a transition period where biological characteristics would be used for identification before the final mark was introduced, conditioning people to accept that their bodies could serve as identification tools, breaking down psychological resistance to biological marking through incremental familiarization. The spiritual significance of this transition remained invisible to most participants, who saw only convenience and security, unable or unwilling to recognize that they were accepting the precedent that would justify the final mark. If your face can unlock your phone, if your fingerprint can access your bank account, if your iris can verify your identity, then why not a simple mark that streamlines all these processes into permanent, unforgeable identification? The digitalization of currency represented yet another stage Elder Paisios described with prophetic precision: the gradual elimination of physical money and the transition to purely digital transactions that could be monitored, controlled, and potentially denied by central authorities. Credit and debit cards had initiated this process, but the emergence of digital payment systems through smartphones, contactless payments, cryptocurrencies, and eventually central bank digital currencies accelerated the transition toward cashless society, where every transaction would be recorded, analyzed, and subject to approval or denial by systems beyond individual control. The elder had warned that the elimination of cash was essential to the final implementation of the mark, because as long as alternative means of transaction existed, people could survive outside the system. But once all commerce became digital and centralized, refusal to participate would mean complete economic exclusion. Governments and financial institutions promoted cashless systems as more efficient, more secure, less expensive to maintain, and better able to prevent criminal activity. Yet each justification served the larger purpose of eliminating anonymous transactions and creating comprehensive financial surveillance that would make economic persecution of dissenters trivially easy to implement. The proposal and gradual implementation of digital identification systems, national ID cards with embedded chips, biometric databases, and ultimately discussions of subcutaneous identification chips represented the convergence of all previous stages toward the final mark Elder Paisios prophesied. Several nations implemented mandatory digital ID systems, connecting biological data to centralized databases, making participation in society dependent on registration in government systems that tracked location, finances, medical history, social connections, and behavior patterns. The elder had warned that there would be reasonable justifications offered for each level of intrusion, preventing identity theft, streamlining government services, improving healthcare coordination, enhancing security against threats, and every justification he predicted emerged exactly as he described, presented through media campaigns that emphasized benefits while minimizing concerns about surveillance and control. The most disturbing aspect of this stage was the enthusiasm with which many populations embraced these systems, having been so thoroughly conditioned by previous stages that they could no longer perceive the spiritual danger, viewing resistance as irrational fear rather than legitimate spiritual defense, exactly as the elder warned would happen when he said that by the time the final mark arrived, most people would be psychologically prepared to accept it without recognizing what they were accepting. Elder Paisios understood that warning about the prophesied danger was insufficient without providing the spiritual tools necessary to resist. And so he devoted equal attention to describing the progression toward the mark and to prescribing the spiritual practices that would enable believers to maintain their connection to divine protection when economic and social pressure became overwhelming. He emphasized that the battle was not primarily physical or political, but spiritual. that the mark represented not just technological control, but spiritual separation, and that resistance required not human strategy, but divine strength accessed through specific practices that Orthodox tradition had preserved across centuries. The elder taught that prayer was the foundation of all spiritual defense, not generic prayer but focused, consistent, disciplined prayer that maintained conscious connection to divine presence throughout every moment of daily life, the kind of prayer that transformed awareness and gradually recalibrated the soul's priorities away from earthly security toward heavenly trust. He specifically recommended the Jesus prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner, repeated constantly until it became as automatic as breathing, creating a continuous spiritual atmosphere that provided protection against the fear and desperation that would compel others to accept the mark for the sake of physical survival. The elder emphasized fasting as essential preparation for the spiritual test that would accompany the mark, explaining that fasting trained the body to endure discomfort and trained the will to choose spiritual benefit over physical satisfaction, creating the inner strength necessary to refuse the mark, even when refusal meant hunger, poverty, and deprivation. He taught that modern Christians had largely abandoned serious fasting, reducing it to token gestures that provided no real spiritual or physical conditioning, and that this spiritual softness would prove catastrophic when the final test arrived because believers would lack the practiced ability to choose discomfort for the sake of principle. Elder Paisios prescribed specific fasting practices that went beyond dietary restriction to include voluntary simplicity, deliberate distance from material comfort, and regular experience of physical discomfort, not as punishment but as training, strengthening the spiritual muscles that would be required to endure economic exclusion and social persecution. He warned that believers who had never practiced serious self-denial would find it nearly impossible to resist the mark when the alternative was watching their children go hungry or losing their homes. But those who had trained through years of fasting would have developed the spiritual fortitude to trust divine providence even when circumstances seemed desperate. Sacramental participation formed the third pillar of Elder Paisios' spiritual defense strategy, particularly regular participation in confession and communion, which he taught provided direct infusion of divine grace that fortified the soul against temptation and fear. He explained that the sacraments were not symbolic rituals, but actual channels of divine energy that transformed human nature at levels beyond psychological or emotional, creating real spiritual protection that operated independently of human understanding or feeling. The elder emphasized that believers needed to establish consistent sacramental practice long before the crisis arrived, because attempting to begin serious spiritual practice during emergency would prove nearly impossible when fear and pressure were at their peak. But those who had built strong sacramental foundations would find that grace provided strength beyond natural human capacity. He specifically warned against the temptation to view faith as merely personal relationship with God that required no ecclesial participation, teaching instead that the church was the physical location where divine grace was dispensed through specific channels that Christ himself established, and that separation from sacramental life meant separation from the primary means of grace that would be absolutely necessary to endure the trial of the mark. Elder Paisios taught that cultivating fearlessness was perhaps the most critical spiritual preparation for the test of the mark, because fear would be the primary weapon used to compel acceptance, fear of poverty, fear of isolation, fear of watching loved ones suffer, fear of death itself. He emphasized that perfect love casts out fear, and that the only antidote to the fear that would drive millions to accept the mark was perfect trust in divine providence, the absolute conviction that God would provide for those who remained faithful, regardless of how impossible circumstances appeared. The elder shared stories from church history of martyrs and confessors who faced death with joy because their trust in divine reality was stronger than their attachment to physical existence, and he insisted that the generation facing the mark would need that same quality of fearlessness, not as emotional bravado, but as deep spiritual conviction that eternal reality mattered infinitely more than temporary circumstances. He taught specific practices for cultivating this fearlessness, meditation on the lives of martyrs, contemplation of eternal rewards versus temporary sufferings, deliberate practice of trusting God in small matters to build confidence for larger trials, and constant prayer for the grace of fearlessness that could only come as divine gift rather than human achievement. The elder prescribed deliberate simplification of life as essential preparation, teaching that believers should progressively reduce their dependence on systems that would later be used to compel acceptance of the mark. He warned against accumulating debt that would create vulnerability to financial coercion, against building lifestyles dependent on high income that would be threatened by economic exclusion, against establishing identity and security through material possessions that could be seized or denied. Elder Paisios taught that voluntary poverty, freely chosen simplicity, and practiced contentment with minimal material resources created both practical resilience and spiritual freedom, making believers less vulnerable to the economic threats that would be used to enforce compliance with the marking system. He emphasized that this simplification needed to happen gradually, as conscious spiritual practice rather than desperate reaction to crisis, because attempting to suddenly embrace poverty during emergency would be psychologically and practically overwhelming. But those who had progressively simplified their lives over years or decades would find themselves naturally prepared for exclusion from economic systems because they had already learned to live with less, to find contentment outside consumerism, and to trust divine provision rather than human security. Finally, Elder Paisios emphasized the critical importance of community, teaching that believers who attempted to face the trial of the mark in isolation would find resistance nearly impossible, but those connected to communities of faith would find mutual support, practical assistance, and spiritual encouragement that made endurance possible. He warned that governments would attempt to isolate resistors, to make refusal of the mark seem like individual choice that affected only the individual, hiding the reality that entire communities would resist together, sharing resources, protecting one another, and creating parallel systems of survival outside the official economy. The elder taught that building these communities needed to happen before the crisis, that believers should identify others committed to resistance, establish relationships of trust and mutual support, develop practical skills for self-sufficiency, and create networks of aid that could function when official systems were closed to them. He emphasized that historical examples of persecution demonstrated that Christian communities had always survived through mutual support, that martyrs were sustained by communities that cared for their families, that confessors endured because brothers and sisters in faith provided material and spiritual assistance, and that the trial of the mark would require the same quality of communal solidarity that had sustained the faithful through every previous persecution in church history.